What if an entire world once thrived in the silent folds of the Alps, only to dissolve into a mist so thick that even history could not remember its true outline? What if beneath the polished museum displays and the confident timelines of our textbooks, there lies a deeper story? One stitched together from fragments of bone, salt-crusted timber, and metal warped by ceremonial fire. And what if everything we think we know about the first great Iron Age culture of Europe is only the surface of a landscape far more intricate, far more fragile, far more easily rewritten than we dare imagine? The Hallstatt culture appears today like a constellation whose brightest stars are still missing. Their voices were consumed by the centuries. Their scripts never reached us. Their memories were carried not by ink, but by soil and stone. What remains is a puzzle assembled from shards, salt mines that preserve wood as if time forgot to pass, burial mounds where princes lie surrounded by wonders from worlds they never saw, trade routes stretching farther than our assumptions allow. Yet somewhere between these traces, there is a silence impossible to ignore. A silence suggesting that something, whether nature, conquest, or the gentle erosion of knowledge, once pressed its hand over this civilization and dimmed its contours. Tonight, we descend into that silence together. Welcome to the Cryptic Realm channel. The sound that first reaches us is not a voice, nor a footstep, nor any trace of language, but a faint tremor under layers of mountain stone, as if something long buried still shifts slightly in its sleep. Archaeologists, standing at the mouth of the old Hallstatt mine, have often spoken of this sensation, though few dare to call it anything more than the settling of ancient timbers. Yet, if we allow ourselves a moment of stillness, the question rises anyway. How could wood cut nearly 3,000 years ago remain so intact that even the grooves of the tool marks are visible? What kind of world did these timbers support? And why does it feel as though they are trying to speak across the depth of ages? The Alps, as we see them today, offer no clear answers. Their peaks appear eternal, indifferent, serene. Their valleys cradle lakes so calm that the sky mistakes them for its own reflection. But the Hallstatt world was born in a far less gentle landscape. When the late Bronze Age fractured around 1200 BCE, an upheaval remembered vaguely in Mediterranean chronicles as the time when palaces fell and harbors emptied, the tremors were felt even here, beyond the last outposts of Mycenaean traders. Climatic shifts crept across Europe, cooling winds sweeping down from the north, rains lengthening their grip on the soil. Fields that once yielded grain with predictable rhythm began faltering. Communities that had relied on long-distance trade for tin, the lifeblood of bronze, found themselves stranded. In that thinning web of connections, the upland valleys of Upper Austria, Carinthia, Bohemia, and the edges of the Carpathian Basin became both isolated and strangely liberated. Cut off from the older systems, these communities turned inward, reshaping their tools, their practices, even their sense of who they were. Iron, once a rare ritual metal, began appearing more frequently. Simple knives, pins, rough blades forged from ore, drawn from the nearby mountains. Not yet symbols of dominance, but quiet suggestions of a coming transformation. The archaeological layers from Stilfried and Velki Grob whisper of this transition. Bronze objects growing smaller, more practical. pottery shifting towards new geometries, iron pieces emerging like cautious intruders into a world defined by fire-polished bronze. But long before these cultural ripples hardened into identity, something else shaped the rhythm of life in these valleys. The land itself, rugged, mineral-rich, threaded with waterways, seemed both to shelter and to test its inhabitants. The Danube flowed like an ancient corridor, linking worlds that would never meet directly. The Enns and the Salzach carved their own passages, guides for traders who carried resin from the Baltic, shells from the Adriatic, dyes from distant coasts. Even in the earliest traces, long before anyone spoke of a Hallstatt culture, there were signs of complexity. Woven textiles hidden beneath fallen earth, wooden bowls still bearing fingerprints of their maker, fragments of antler tools worn smooth by repeated use. And yet, for all this evidence, the people remain strangely absent from their own story. We can imagine them, watching storms creep over the mountains, tending livestock on high pastures, carving geometric marks into fresh clay. But imagination is not certainty. Their names did not survive. Their spoken words dissolved centuries before the first alphabet reached these slopes. Their memories lie folded into layers of sediment and salt, waiting for patient hands to uncover them. It is this silence, more than anything else, that gives the early Hallstatt landscape its haunting weight. The material fragments insist on a world of astonishing intricacy, but the voices that lived within it have slipped beyond reach. Perhaps this is what draws researchers to return again and again. The peculiar mixture of recognition and obscurity, as though the past is close enough to feel but too distant to grasp. Each new excavation reveals more details: the angle of a roof beam, the curvature of a ceramic lip, the residual trace of ancient grains. But the core remains elusive. Who were these people poised on the threshold between bronze and iron, between isolation and emergence? How did they see themselves within the shifting patterns of climate, trade, and ritual that were reshaping the continent? And if the origins of Hallstatt are wrapped in this gentle uncertainty, what deeper mysteries wait in the centuries that follow, when iron glowed hotter, trade routes stretched farther, and the mountains themselves seemed to open their hidden chambers to human ambition? Something lingers in the strata beneath the earliest Hallstatt layers, a faint contradiction that archaeologists hesitate to name. If these valleys were once remote corners of Europe, why do traces of the wider world keep resurfacing in their soil? A fragment of amber shaped by Baltic tides, a shell touched by Mediterranean currents, a pigment whose origin lies closer to Crete than to Corinthia. Objects that should not be here, not unless there were hands willing to cross landscapes far broader than we imagine for a Bronze Age community. What paths did these objects travel? And who first laid those paths down? The mountains do not answer, but they guide. The ridges arch like frozen waves around the lakes, shaping the movement of anyone who attempts to cross them. Narrow passes open briefly in summer, then vanish beneath winter snows. A traveler following the Salzach or Enns would have known the rhythm of these rivers intimately, the way spring meltwater carried timber down from higher slopes, the way autumn fog could turn familiar routes into twilight labyrinths. Perhaps it was this knowledge, patient, seasonal, and older than metallurgy that allowed early Hallstatt communities to stitch their world to distant coastlines without leaving written records of their journeys. Archaeological deposits speak more clearly than speculation. In the settlement layers of Magdalenaberg and the high terraces above the Traunsee, there are indications of workshops more organized than simple village craft. Furnaces appear beside storage pits. Slag heaps rise in predictable arcs. Pieces of ore are stacked deliberately as though reserved for specific smiths. Iron ore from the Eastern Alps is unusually pure, needing less refining than the bog iron used elsewhere in Europe. A community with access to such resources would eventually discover that iron kept an edge longer than bronze and could be worked in simpler furnaces so long as the fuel burned hot enough. Yet in these early stages, the metal's significance was not purely practical. Many iron objects from the 10th and 9th centuries BCE were placed in graves, as if the cold, dark earth demanded offerings forged from the bones of the mountain itself. Still, these early ironworkers were not isolated magicians of fire. Bronzesmiths continued their separate traditions, shaping ornaments with fine geometric ridges, applying corded designs to pottery, and refining casting techniques inherited from the Urnfield world. Two systems, one old, one new, lived side by side, each adjusting to changing climates and dwindling access to tin. It is tempting to imagine conflict between them, but the evidence suggests coexistence rather than rivalry. The shift from bronze to iron was slow, almost hesitant, as though the people sensed that changing the material of their tools meant rewriting more than just technique. It meant redefining the rituals, the symbols, and the social meanings attached to metal itself. Along the hillsides, near modern-day Hallstatt, traces of early mining operations hint at another axis of identity forming. These were not yet the deep labyrinths of the later Hallstatt period, but shallow cuts, exploratory tunnels, and scattered wooden supports. The miners must have understood something crucial even then, that the mountains held within them more than iron. The salt veins, ancient, dense, glistening with their own pale light, offered a power as essential as metal. Salt preserved food, sustained livestock, and allowed trade to flourish long after harvests failed. If a community learned to extract such a resource reliably, it would no longer be bound by the uncertainties of climate alone. But in these earliest workings, there is another question. Who first ventured into those dark passages with nothing more than pine torches and stone hammers? What compelled them to carve into the mountain at all? Perhaps necessity drove them, or curiosity, or ritual obligation. Perhaps the salt itself, crystalline and unyielding, seemed like a substance worthy of reverence, the kind of material that might bridge the visible world and the hidden one. The more one considers these beginnings, the more the outlines of early Hallstatt life blur and sharpen simultaneously. The shapes of dwellings, the scatter of tools, the patterns of burial all suggest a society reassembling itself after the great disruptions of the late Bronze Age. Yet just as the picture becomes clearer, another veil descends. Why do so few human traces survive from this era compared to the abundance preserved in later centuries? Were the early communities smaller, more mobile, or simply less fortunate in the long lottery of preservation? And if their presence feels so ghost-like now, what transformations awaited them as iron grew hotter, mines deepened, and trade routes entwined their valleys with the far edges of the continent? There is a place above the lake where the morning light touches the ridgeline before it reaches the water. A narrow shelf of land where archaeologists found something that unsettled expectations. Scattered among the layers of soil were fragments of pottery, but not merely the domestic sort. These vessels carried incised lines so precise, so deliberate, that they seemed less like decoration and more like the quiet emergence of a new visual language. Why would people living in a landscape of rugged survival take the time to carve such intricate geometric rhythms into clay? What message did they press into these surfaces, and to whom was it addressed? The marks themselves offer no translation, yet the style, the balance between incised grooves and polished surfaces, appears almost mathematical. Concentric circles repeat with unusual symmetry. Zigzag strokes stretch in measured intervals. Patterns echo those seen across the remnants of the Urnfield tradition. But something in the Hallstatt forms feels more controlled, more focused, as if the act of shaping a vessel had become a way of stabilizing the disorder of a world slowly recovering from earlier collapse. Clay, unlike metal, accepts fingerprints, accepts hesitation, accepts the pressure of a potter's breath. Perhaps these artisans were grounding themselves through geometry when history around them had yet to settle. The context of these patterns deepens the mystery. Many of the vessels were discovered near burial grounds, modest ones compared to the monumental mounds of later centuries, but nonetheless carefully arranged. Cremation remained dominant, though altered in subtle ways. Bones were gathered with an attention that feels almost ceremonial, placed into urns that were sometimes larger than necessary. Grave goods were sparse but chosen with care. A bronze pin shaped like a bird's beak, a small iron blade, a pottery cup with a rim that bore the faint outline of cord-wrap decoration. Not items of wealth, but tokens of identity. It is as though the early Hallstatt communities were quietly redefining their relationship to the dead, feeling their way toward new forms of ritual that would one day grow into elaborate ceremonies and monumental tombs. Yet it was not only death that shaped these early expressions, it was connection. The same layers that contain local pottery also reveal traces of materials from beyond the Alps. A sliver of amber worn smooth through handling, a bead carved from bone belonging to an animal not native to the region, a small fragment of bronze whose alloy proportions resemble those used in northern Italy. These fragments do not suggest grand caravans or sweeping migrations. Instead, they hint at contact maintained through subtle, persistent exchanges. Narrow mountain paths might have seen lone traders or seasonal travelers carrying small bundles of goods, sharing stories, transmitting ideas in fragments too small to leave written echoes. How many such encounters dissolved into the everyday, unnoticed by chroniclers who would not appear for centuries? The early settlements reflect this blend of stability and adaptation. Excavations near the edge of the Hallstatt Lake revealed the foundations of structures built from timber hewn with bronze tools, their walls once woven with wattle and sealed with clay. Hearths show repeated use, layered ash embedded with charred seeds, barley, millet, emmer wheat, suggesting meals shaped by both tradition and necessity. Animal bones scattered near these dwellings speak of livestock herding, but also of hunts that reached into the thick forests encircling the settlement. Life was neither primitive nor luxurious. It balanced between the rhythms of nature and the growing complexity of a society discovering its new identity. Still, as archaeologists sift through these remnants, a question shadows their work. Why do certain patterns appear abruptly, as though emerging from a moment of inspiration, while others linger unchanged for generations? Cultural evolution rarely moves in straight lines. Perhaps these early Hallstatt communities were receiving influences from places we have yet to identify. Lost settlements, vanished groups whose material traces eroded long before the first spade touched the earth. Or perhaps the innovations arose internally, born from individuals whose names have disappeared, yet whose gestures still survive in the curvature of pottery or the angle of a burial pit. Whatever the origins, one thing becomes clear. These early expressions, fragile though they are, form the first murmurs of a culture that will soon reshape the heart of Europe. But what forces were gathering in the landscape, preparing to transform small communities into a civilization recognized across continents? And when the mountains finally opened their deeper chambers of salt and iron, what new paths would unfold before the Hallstatt people? There is a curious tension in the early Hallstatt landscape, a kind of quiet contradiction embedded not in human artifacts, but in the land itself. If these valleys were merely remote and provincial, as some older historical narratives claimed, then why does the terrain reveal signs of early engineering choices that feel far too deliberate for scattered communities recovering from the Bronze Age collapse? A line of stones arranged to stabilize eroding soil. A platform built near a stream in a place where water flow shifts unpredictably. Traces of terracing that seem intended to nurture crops on slopes too steep for comfort. These fragments suggest a deeper level of organization than we might expect. But who coordinated such efforts? And why do the earliest settlements show both the intimacy of kin-based living and the faint outline of a larger, more structured vision? The land itself may hold part of the answer. The Alps are vast, but here, near the lakes and rivers that thread through modern-day Upper Austria, the mountains do something unusual. They narrow into corridors where movement becomes almost choreographed by the terrain. Anyone living in these valleys would have sensed that they were positioned along a series of natural thresholds. To the east lay the Carpathian Basin with its open plains. To the north, vast forests stretching toward the Baltic. To the south and west, the distant pull of the Mediterranean world. No single region claimed them fully. Instead, these valleys formed a nexus, quiet, rugged, and vulnerable to every shift in climate and trade that rippled across the continent. And climate was shifting. Pollen evidence extracted from lake beds near Hallstatt suggests a subtle but steady cooling trend after 1200 BCE, enough to reduce yields for communities that relied heavily on agriculture. Yet the botanical layers also reveal increasing use of grasses and wild crops, signs of adaptive foraging rather than collapse. This resilience, carved into the soil itself, hints at a people willing to experiment when conditions changed. Why cling to old rhythms when new ones might keep hunger at bay? Still, the most enigmatic environmental record comes from inside the mountains, where early miners carved shallow channels into salt-rich rock. Salt is a preservative, and in these ancient tunnels, time behaves differently. Wood lasts centuries instead of decades. Textile fibers linger. Food residues remain surprisingly vivid. Among these early finds are wooden tools shaped with a precision suggesting generations of practice. Shovels with curved edges optimized for scraping salt surfaces. Woven ropes whose fibers still carry the memory of strain, and torches whose charred tips speak of men and women descending into darkness long before iron lamps illuminated European mines. These objects raise the question, did the Hallstatt relationship with salt begin purely as a pragmatic response to scarcity, or did it already carry ritual significance, a sense that entering the mountain meant entering a different realm of existence? Salt has always held symbolic weight in human societies, long before it became commodity. It preserves, purifies, and alters. It resists decay. The earliest evidence from the Hallstatt mines suggests that those who ventured inward might have viewed the act as something more than labor. Perhaps the steady dripping of brine, the echo of picks against stone, and the gleam of crystalline walls created sensations that blurred the boundary between work and ceremony. And if the mountain felt alive, an ancient presence that offered sustenance, how might this have shaped the myths and rituals of the people who lived around it? Yet if salt provided a path inward, iron offered a path outward. With each new discovery of iron blades or tools in early Hallstatt contexts, the picture becomes more layered. These objects show differing levels of skill. Some hammered into shape with tentative strokes, others forged by hands confident in the material's capability. This variation hints at a network of smiths sharing knowledge across regions. It is possible, though unproven, that certain valleys served as early teaching centers, where ore quality allowed experimentation. But as always, the record is fragmented. Pieces of slag here, a broken anvil stone there. Enough to suggest complexity, but not enough to reveal its full form. The coexistence of salt miners, ironworkers, farmers, hunters, potters, and traders raises an inevitable question. What force, or perhaps what subtle pressure, kept these early communities in fragile equilibrium? There is no sign of central authority, no grand monument asserting dominance, no written decree organizing labor. And yet, the evidence of coordinated effort is there, seated quietly beneath the layers of earth. If such coordination existed without clear symbols of power, then what kind of leadership guided these early Hallstatt people? And how would this invisible structure evolve when the mountains began revealing resources powerful enough to reshape entire regions? There is a detail in the archaeological record that often passes unnoticed, perhaps because it feels too small to matter. The distribution of dwellings on the slopes above the early Hallstatt lakes. Some lie close together, scarcely more than a few meters apart, while others stand at measured intervals, as if placed according to rules no longer visible. Was this simply coincidence, the result of families settling where the land allowed, or do these patterns whisper of a social logic that has yet to be fully understood? Wooden foundations tell a story through their wear. Some show repeated repairs, layers of clay replastered after storms, beams replaced with care. Others appear abandoned after only a short time, the soil beneath them hinting at landslides or shifting water channels. In certain excavations, traces of communal hearths appear, ashes interwoven with seeds and bones from shared meals. These remnants suggest more than survival. They gesture toward gatherings, perhaps seasonal, perhaps ritual, where the valley's people converged to reaffirm bonds that reached beyond household walls. If there were leaders, they left no standing stone to mark their presence. Yet in the patterns of habitation, something intentional takes shape, an undercurrent of organization without overt monumentality. It is within this quiet order that we find the first signs of specialization emerging, not as strict roles, but as tendencies. The household where pottery shards accumulate in unusual quantity, the slope where slag from early smelting lies heaped near a stream, the clearing where textiles were once stretched to dry, threads still clinging in microscopic fragments to the earth. Each cluster hints at a craft becoming more than a necessity, evolving into identity. But how did these identities fit together? Did the people see themselves as parts of a greater whole, or as families linked only by proximity and shared environment? Hints come from objects found far from where they were made. A bronze brooch resembling styles known from the Slovak lowlands appears in an alpine settlement where such metalwork was rare. A textile fragment, woven with a technique more common near the Danube, turns up high above the Traunsee. These are not isolated curiosities. They reflect connections subtle but persistent. Perhaps certain individuals, skilled negotiators, or respected elders were responsible for maintaining distant relationships. Their influence would not require grandeur. It might manifest instead in the smooth circulation of goods, the shared patterns that spread without coercion, the quiet knowledge that a valley was never entirely alone. This interconnectedness becomes even clearer when examining burial practices from the period. Though cremation dominated, the manner of arranging remains varied slightly across regions. In one valley, ashes were placed inside plain urns with minimal adornment. In another, the remains were accompanied by carefully selected objects: an iron blade placed with its edge turned downward, a bronze ring positioned near where the wrist once lay, a pottery vessel containing what chemical analysis suggests may have been dried herbs. These differences may reflect local customs, or perhaps status distinctions not expressed in everyday architecture. Ritual, in its simplest form, becomes the mirror through which a community reveals how it understands life, death, and its place in the cosmos. But the most striking component of these early rituals may be the repetition of certain symbols. Birds, especially waterfowl, appear again and again, their shapes rendered in bronze, incised into pottery, suggested by the curvature of pins and ornaments. Why birds, and why these specific ones? Waterfowl migrate across vast distances, returning each year to familiar shores. Their cycles mirror the ebb and flow of communities bound to seasons, trade, and the movement of flocks and herds. Did the early Hallstatt people view these birds as guides, as intermediaries between worlds, or as reminders that life always extends beyond the borders of a single valley? We cannot say for certain, but the persistence of these motifs suggests a worldview slowly crystallizing, shaped by environment, craft, and quiet interaction with distant regions. The communities were no longer simply surviving. They were beginning to imagine themselves through symbols, rituals, and shared practices. If such ideas were already forming in the earliest centuries, then what transformations would arise when the mountains revealed the full scale of their resources and the people stepped into a wider, more ambitious stage of history? There is a passage in the mountain layers where the evidence becomes strangely dense, as though the earth itself paused to gather a breath before revealing what would come next. Between two bands of sediment, one dark with traces of forest fire, the other pale with compacted frost, archaeologists uncovered signs of intensified activity. More furnaces, more slag, more tools discarded in haste. Why does this particular horizon, spanning only a few generations, hold such concentrated motion? Was it coincidence, or the first pulse of something far larger awakening beneath the surface of Hallstatt life? The iron tells a story, though only in fragments. The earliest blades were uneven, their edges brittle where the carbon had pooled imperfectly. Yet just a few layers above, the texture of the metal grows more consistent, the forging marks more confident. Someone, perhaps several someones, had begun experimenting. They heated the iron to glowing white, folded it, hammered it, quenched it, and tried again. Over time, these hands learned how to coax the ore into forms the mountains had never seen. The work may have taken place in small hearth forges scattered among dwellings, but the effect was profound. Improved tools cut timber faster, shaped beams straighter, carved channels for water more efficiently. With every refinement, the landscape itself became more malleable. Still, iron alone does not explain the sudden concentration of activity. The larger change may lie in the relationship between metalwork and movement. Along the riverbanks near the Danube, at points where the current narrows and stones break the water into braided channels, traces of temporary encampments appeared. Hearth remains, broken pots, discarded animal bones, a bronze needle lying far from any known settlement, remnants that suggest stopovers along a route rather than permanent habitation. Did iron tools enable more ambitious travel, allowing people to journey farther without fear of tool failure? Or did the promise of distant exchange draw them outward, each trip weaving another thin thread into a growing web of contact? The rivers themselves seemed complicit in this expansion. The Danube, even then, served as a long, slow road, carrying travelers east and west with a patience unmatched by land paths. Smaller tributaries, the Enns, the Tron, the Inn, fed into it like veins. A single wooden boat, carved from a hollowed trunk and sealed with resin, could drift from the high alpine valleys into far broader worlds. Perhaps the people knew this intuitively, for certain finds appear repeatedly along these waterways. Clay molds for casting metal, shards of decorated pottery, and enigmatic stones whose polished surfaces suggest they were used for sharpening blades. It is as though the rivers carried not only travelers, but also the emerging identity of a culture still finding its shape. Yet within the settlements themselves, another layer of intensity was building. Storage pits grew deeper, their walls reinforced with woven branches and clay. Grain impressions found on pottery suggest harvests being preserved with greater care, perhaps in anticipation of winters that stretched longer than before. Wooden granaries stood on stone supports, raised to protect their contents from moisture and rodents. The presence of these structures points to something more coordinated, a growing awareness that resources needed management beyond the household level. But if such collective effort existed, why is there no clear sign of leaders? No single house larger than the rest? No artifact that claims authority? The silence around leadership becomes even more intriguing when considering ritual deposits from this period. At a marsh near the edge of a valley, a cluster of objects was found. A bent bronze knife, a broken spearhead, and a carved wooden figurine whose shape may represent a human form, though time has blurred its details. These items were placed deliberately in waterlogged soil, where retrieval would have been difficult. Offerings most likely, but offered by whom? A family? A group? A figure of influence whose role left no architectural footprint. The more these pieces are examined, the clearer the tension becomes between what is visible and what remains hidden. The society was changing, and the changes were not random. Metalwork advanced, storage increased, travel expanded, ritual shifted. But where was the center of gravity? What force coordinated these developments without leaving a singular emblem of power? If these early intensifications were the prelude to Hallstatt's rise, how would the communities respond when the mountains opened not only their shallow veins of salt, but their immense plunging caverns, promising wealth on a scale no valley had ever known? There is a moment in the Hallstatt archaeological record where the traces of ordinary life and the traces of something far more carefully curated begin to diverge. In one layer, the remains of daily existence lie scattered almost casually. Broken pots, hearth ash, splintered bones of cattle. But just a few steps away, in a soil stratum no deeper, carefully arranged deposits appear. Tools placed with their handles facing east, ornaments aligned along invisible lines of symmetry. Fragments of antler laid out in a pattern too intentional to be accidental. Why would such precision appear so abruptly, as though someone had drawn a boundary between what was merely lived and what was meant to be remembered? The answer may lie in the growing mastery of materials unfolding during this period. Ironworking was no longer tentative. The smiths of the valleys had begun controlling heat with a sophistication not seen in earlier centuries. The slag from furnaces shows increased separation of impurities, and the metal objects themselves bear hallmarks of intentional carburization. Charcoal fragments found near these forges reveal wood selection that seems almost ritualistic. Oak, ash, and beech, chosen not only for burn temperature, but perhaps for symbolic resonance. There are no written testimonies, yet the evidence suggests that metal was no longer simply forged. It was invoked. This shift in craftsmanship coincides with another development, the steady deepening of the salt mines. The early tunnels had been shallow, exploratory, but now the descent grew steeper, the galleries extending farther into the mountain's interior. Wooden supports from this period show marks of advanced joinery, mortise and tenon joints, reinforced by wedges rather than nails. These constructions suggest a growing engineering intelligence, an understanding of load distribution and underground stability far beyond what one might expect from small alpine communities. The deeper miners traveled, the more their environment changed. Air thinning, silence thickening, salt crystals glittering in the torchlight like stars pressed into stone. Was it possible that descending into such depths altered not only their techniques, but their conception of the world? Salt, after all, was becoming something more than a resource. Residues on pottery and tools indicate that its use expanded beyond food preservation. It entered ritual practice. Certain ceramic vessels, found only in the vicinity of the mines, contain traces of brine mixed with herbs and animal fat. Some scholars interpret these as offerings meant to protect miners before they entered the mountain. Others suggest they played a role in ceremonies marking transitions between seasons, between social roles, perhaps even between life and death. But how many such rituals have vanished, dissolved like grains of salt in water? The growing complexity of craft and ritual coincided with a new kind of settlement pattern. Houses began clustering near the entrances to the mines, while fields stretched farther into the valleys below. This redistribution implies a subtle reorganization of daily life, a recalibration of priorities. Those who ventured underground may have occupied a distinct status, though no burial definitively confirms this. Yet among grave goods from this period, certain items, worn hammerstones, distinctive miner's picks, carved wooden spade handles, appear in contexts suggesting reverence. Perhaps these were not merely tools, but symbols of an emerging identity tied to the hidden chambers of the mountain. Trade, too, responded to these shifts. More Mediterranean pottery appears in the layers associated with deep mining activity, not in vast quantities, but enough to indicate connection. And alongside imported vessels, fragments of coral and bronze fittings from the south surface with increasing frequency. These are not the grand luxury items of later Hallstatt elites, but their presence signals a widening horizon, suggesting that the valleys were no longer simply recipients of distant goods, but participants in an ever-expanding exchange network. How many stories traveled along with these objects? Whispered accounts of distant seas, foreign rites, unfamiliar gods. Amid this growing complexity, a more subtle transformation was occurring, the shaping of landscape into memory. Terraces grew deeper, pathways more defined, fences marking boundaries that might once have been fluid. The people of these valleys were no longer merely reacting to climate and terrain. They were sculpting their environment to mirror their evolving sense of order. This shift is visible not in grand monuments, but in small, persistent choices. Choices that would one day echo in the fortified centers of the Hallstatt Golden Age. Yet, as these subtle foundations took form, one cannot help wondering, what force or realization pushed the community from quiet equilibrium toward a trajectory that would carry them into a period of unprecedented wealth, power, and cultural influence? Was it the mines alone, or something stirring across Europe that would soon reshape the fate of every valley, every river, every metal forged in fire? And when these currents converged, how would the Hallstatt people respond to the vast transformation waiting just beyond the horizon? There is a moment in the archaeological record when the movement of goods across the Hallstatt valleys begins to defy the assumptions once made about early Iron Age Europe. A shard of pottery, painted with a style unmistakably Etruscan, appears in a midden, far from any known trade hub. A fragment of glass, its blue hue characteristic of workshops in the northern Adriatic, emerges beside a simple storage pit. A bronze ornament containing trace elements of copper mined near the Balkans lies next to an alpine crafted pin. None of these objects are large enough to suggest the sweeping trade caravans described in later history. Yet their presence raises a quiet question. Were these valleys truly peripheral? Or were they participants in a subtle, far-reaching web of exchange that left almost no written trace? Perhaps the rivers knew before the people did. The Salzach and the Inn, fed by glacial melt and mountain springs, run with a constancy that belies their treacherous bends. Boats carved from single tree trunks could drift for days along their currents, carrying not only salt and metals, but also stories. Stories that might have traveled farther than any object ever did. Even in eras when written script had not yet entered these valleys, memory likely flowed downstream. A gesture copied from a traveler's clothing, a pattern borrowed from a foreign vessel, a rumor carried on wind and water about distant lands recovering from their own collapses. These intangible exchanges may have shaped Hallstatt identity as profoundly as the goods themselves. If such connections existed, their social impact becomes visible in subtle but persistent changes. Around this period, burial assemblages begin to include items that seem chosen not merely for the dead, but for the story they tell the living. A bronze razor with a handle carved in a foreign style. A drinking cup whose curvature resembles vessels found along the upper Adriatic. A necklace whose beads, though simple, bear the warm, translucent glow of Baltic amber. These traces suggest individuals who either traveled themselves or encountered those who did. Individuals whose lives were touched by places far beyond the line of sight from any alpine ridge. What did they speak of when they returned? What landscapes did they describe to those who had never left the valleys? The effects of such exchanges extended into everyday life. The thick-walled pottery used for storage begins to show more standardized proportions, implying that certain vessels were being shaped for predictable quantities: grain, dried meat, perhaps even salt portions intended for trade. The architecture hints at transition as well. Homes built with slightly broader thresholds, as if anticipating increased movement of goods, or perhaps simply of people. Along certain paths, layers of compacted soil indicate repeated foot traffic, while small clusters of hearths near river crossings imply seasonal gatherings or temporary markets. None of these traces form a clear narrative on their own, but together they suggest a growing sense of openness, a willingness to engage with a world suddenly wider than before. Even the symbolic realm reflects this shift. The geometric motifs once carved with rigid precision soften subtly, their angles bending toward curves. Spirals appear more frequently, reminiscent of patterns seen in regions far to the west and south. It is impossible to know whether these motifs spread through direct interaction or through slower, generational absorption. Yet their appearance suggests that the Hallstatt people were beginning to see themselves in relation to broader cycles of trade, climate, migration, perhaps even fate. In some graves, pottery vessels containing residues of fermented beverages appear, hinting at feasts that might have celebrated not only life and death, but also alliances, journeys, or shared origins. Still, the growing openness brings with it another question. How were these exchanges curated? Who determined which goods were worthy of keeping, which stories worth repeating, which symbols worth adopting? Leadership structures remain invisible in the archaeological record, and yet the cohesive spread of new ideas suggests influence, quiet, distributed influence, perhaps carried by those who traveled most or handled the materials others never saw. As the networks widened and distant worlds drew nearer, the Hallstatt valleys were slowly becoming more than isolated communities. They were evolving into nodes in a continental rhythm, actors in a story of exchange, adaptation, and growing complexity. But with each new connection came new pressures, and one cannot help wondering, what would happen when the convergence of trade, technology, and environmental change demanded not merely adaptation, but transformation on a scale their ancestors could never have foreseen? There is a layer of earth near the edge of the Hallstatt Lake where something unexpected emerges. Not an artifact, but an absence. In a stratum where one would expect domestic debris, the ground is strangely clean, as if the people who once lived here cleared their traces with a precision bordering on ritual. Why would a community erase signs of its own daily life? Was it a response to shifting climate, a reorganization of space, or something more elusive? A deliberate gesture to mark a boundary between the world above and something stirring below the surface. Just beyond this anomalous patch of soil, the earliest signs of large-scale salt extraction appear. Where shallow cuts once sufficed, deeper shafts now pierce the mountain like arteries reaching toward an unseen heart. The wooden supports from this phase reveal not only technical knowledge, but also marks of repeated replacement, suggesting continuous work across seasons. Salt dust still clings to the fibers of ancient ropes, implying loads heavier than those carried in earlier centuries. And within the deeper galleries, archaeologists found an unusual concentration of discarded torches, their char patterns indicating prolonged use, as though the miners lingered longer in the underground than before. What compelled them to descend deeper, risking collapse, darkness, and the suffocating weight of the mountain? It is tempting to imagine the answer lies purely in economy, that increased demand for salt pushed them further inward. Yet the material record complicates this picture. Near some of the mine entrances, small clusters of objects appear that do not resemble functional tools. Carved bone pendants, fragments of figurines, bits of pottery marked with symbols that do not match domestic wares. These were not lost items, Their placement suggests intention. Could these objects represent offerings, tokens left to appease forces believed to dwell within the mountain? Or were they markers of identity, left by those whose lives revolved around the mines, claiming space through symbols rather than speech? Above ground, life also began to shift. Settlements expanded along pathways leading to the mine openings. Timber-framed structures grew more robust, their foundations reinforced against the vibrations of continuous labor. Some houses display architectural anomalies, elongated rooms whose dimensions suggest communal storage, small annexes containing nothing but evidence of weaving or hide preparation, entrances aligned with uncanny precision toward the high slopes where mine shafts opened. These patterns hint that mining and settlement were becoming intertwined not merely through labor, but through a shared sense of purpose. The intensification of mining coincides with a subtle change in burial practices. Though cremation remained common, certain graves feature items that seem connected to underground work. Wooden shovels burned, yet still recognizable. Pick heads placed parallel to the body, torches laid beside urns. These inclusions imply that the role of miner had begun to carry symbolic weight, perhaps even spiritual significance. To enter the mountain might have been seen as entering a liminal realm, a place where the living trespassed on spaces typically reserved for the dead or the divine. And if salt preserved life above ground, what did its luminous veins represent in the minds of those who carved them open? Even the natural environment responded to these subterranean endeavors. Pollen records suggest forest thinning around this time, likely caused by increased demand for timber to support and fuel the mines. But alongside this deforestation, evidence appears of deliberate replanting, saplings of specific species planted near settlements. Such patterns imply planning, foresight, and understanding that extraction required renewal. It raises the possibility that the Hallstatt people were developing long-term strategies for managing their landscape, strategies that hint at organization more complex than simple village life. Still, amid this increasing sophistication, one question deepens: who coordinated these efforts? If there were leaders, their authority left no monumental traces. Yet the synchronization of mining, settlement growth, timber management, and ritual practice cannot be coincidence. Something, whether tradition, belief, or an emerging form of social cohesion, began shaping collective behavior. And if such cohesion was forming around the mountain's depths, what would happen when the mines reached their full potential, unleashing wealth and influence far beyond anything the early Hallstatt world had known? There is a point in the Hallstatt archaeological sequence where the nature of warfare becomes visible, not through shattered fortifications or mass graves, but through the smallest and most personal of objects. A blade worn thin at the edge, a shield boss dented by an impact long forgotten, a spearhead deliberately bent before being placed in the soil. Why would a community that left so few signs of centralized authority begin to mark its landscape with traces of conflict and ritualized weaponry? And why do these traces emerge precisely as mining and trade were accelerating? as if prosperity itself had drawn new forms of danger to their valleys. The early weapons found in the region are modest, short iron blades, sometimes little more than tools, but gradually their shapes evolve. The balance shifts, the tangs lengthen, the points sharpen into a geometry meant not for utility, but for combat. Iron allowed for innovation, and the smiths, already versed in the craft of layering and heat, began shaping forms that carried an unmistakable intention. Yet the battlefields of this era remain invisible. There are no charred settlement layers indicating raids, no defensive ramparts sturdy enough to suggest prolonged sieges. Instead, conflict appears subtly, like distant thunder, whose echoes reach the ground before the storm itself is seen. Perhaps the most evocative evidence lies not in the weapons themselves, but in where they were found. In certain marshes near the river valleys, concentrations of bent swords and shattered spearheads appear, deposited deliberately in waterlogged soil. Their edges show no marks of heavy combat. Instead, the metal appears killed, a practice known across Europe in which weapons were rendered unusable before being offered to forces believed to reside in lakes, rivers, or the unseen spaces between worlds. Such offerings were not acts of fear alone. They carried meaning, petitions, gratitude, or warnings whispered to entities who shape the fates of communities. As these deposits increase, signs of defensive architecture begin to appear on hilltops overlooking major routes. Not grand fortresses, but modest enclosures, earthworks reinforced with timber palisades. Their construction suggests a growing awareness of vulnerability. Perhaps travelers brought news of unrest beyond the Alps, shifts in groups to the north, pressures from the Danubian plains, movements stirring across the distant steppe. Trade widened horizons, but it also widened risk. With more paths connecting these valleys to the continent, the chance of unwanted contact grew accordingly. Within settlements, certain objects reflect a response to these tensions. The presence of helmets, even simple bronze caps, signals an evolving martial identity. Shields appear in symbolic forms as well, carved into pottery or etched into metal fittings. These images are never grand or boastful. They appear quietly, as though acknowledging danger without seeking to celebrate it. The Hallstatt people may have understood that conflict was not a spectacle, but a shadow, one that expanded as their wealth increased. Yet, the weapons made during this time also carry traces of ceremony. Some blades bear patterns of inlay or incised motifs that seem too intricate for everyday use. A few swords were found wrapped in textiles, preserved not for battle, but for death, as though the weapon and its owner shared a bond strong enough to extend beyond the grave. These symbolic tools speak to a belief system in which warriorhood was not defined solely by aggression, but by role, duty, perhaps even burden, in a world shaped by unpredictable forces. Climate, terrain, trade. Those who bore arms might have been seen not as conquerors, but as mediators between community and chaos. The simultaneous rise of martial artifacts and mining prosperity invites another question. Were the Hallstatt communities arming themselves to protect the wealth emerging from the mountain? Salt was becoming valuable enough to attract attention. Iron tools accelerated production, and trade routes carried their resources far beyond their homeland. Could such prosperity remain unnoticed by neighboring groups, or even by distant societies seeking new sources of influence? And yet, despite signs of increasing tension, the archaeological record shows no catastrophic destruction in this period. Instead, it hints at negotiation, diplomatic exchanges conducted through gifts, marriages, shared feasts, whose remnants still linger in ceramic residue. If conflict loomed, it was met with strategies shaped not only by iron and salt, but by subtle diplomacy. Still, as weapons grew sharper and offerings more elaborate, a final question emerges. What transformation was approaching? What shift in power, ritual, or ambition that would soon elevate Hallstatt from a network of valleys into one of the most influential cultural forces in early Iron Age Europe? There is a moment when the Hallstatt world seems to inhale, quietly but unmistakably, as if preparing for a transformation whose echo will travel across centuries. It becomes visible not in the mines or the weapons, but in the architecture perched above rivers and valleys. Why, after generations of modest dwellings, do the first fortified hilltop settlements begin to rise? Why do certain communities lift themselves onto elevated ridges, as though seeking vantage against both opportunity and threat? The earliest of these high settlements reveal no grand walls or imposing gates, only traces of timber palisades anchored into packed earth. Yet their placement is deliberate, almost strategic. From these heights, the Hallstatt people could watch the river corridors winding below, corridors that increasingly carried more than water. Traders passed with goods from the Mediterranean and amber from the Baltic. Travelers moved between cultures whose names we know only through scattered myths and ruined scripts. The elevated settlement seemed to declare not conquest, but awareness. The valleys were no longer isolated worlds. They were crossroads. Inside these early hilltop enclosures, the archaeological record shows another shift. Houses grow larger, their walls thicker, their internal spaces more varied. Hearths appear in corners rather than centered, suggesting control of warmth and smoke rather than mere survival. Fragments of pottery found here bear more refined patterns, geometric sequences flowing with new confidence. And among the debris of daily life, animal bones, broken blades, scorched wood, lie remnants of specialized workshops. Bronze scraps shaped by precise casting techniques. Loom weights clustered near walls where textiles once hung. Charcoal pits suggesting controlled, high-temperature metallurgical work. These elevated communities were not simply defensive refuges. They were centers of production, hubs where craft, strategy, and ritual began to converge. The people who lived here likely sensed their status shifting. Their homes overlooked landscapes where others labored. Fields, forests, riverbanks, and mines. Such vantage points change perception. Perhaps those on the heights saw patterns the valley dwellers could not. The timing of distant fires signaling travelers' approach. The shimmer of goods carried downstream. The flow of herds grazing across shifting pastures. In such a position, leadership might have emerged not from force, but from perspective. Those who could read the land, predict its moods, and coordinate responses without leaving behind written laws or towering monuments. Evidence of distant influence grows stronger during this time. In some high settlements, small quantities of imported pottery appear, their surfaces covered with motifs reminiscent of Etruscan workshops. Bronze vessels bearing traces of Greek stylistic choices surface in elite contexts. But the most intriguing finds are not luxury objects. They are fragments of coral, tiny, pink-red pieces far from any sea. Coral carries symbolic weight in many ancient cultures. Protection, prestige, connection to distant waters. Its presence here raises questions about the Hallstatt worldview. Did those who possessed such items consider themselves linked to distant shorelines, even if they had never seen the sea? Or did these materials become part of a new, symbolic vocabulary, shaping social identity within communities perched above the valleys? Alongside these exotic materials, the local environment shows signs of careful management. On slopes surrounding the hilltop settlements, traces of terraced agriculture appear, suggesting an effort to secure food supplies for larger, more stable populations. Forests bear marks of selective harvesting rather than simple clearing. Even the paths leading upward grow more defined, worn smooth by repeated journeying. These patterns indicate planning, a sense that the settlements on the heights required a system of support extending across the landscape. But if such coordination existed, how was it enforced or negotiated without visible hierarchies? Within the same layers, burial practices shift once again. Graves associated with individuals from these heights contain a subtle concentration of high-quality objects. Bronze pins with intricate cross-hatching, iron knives with carefully sharpened edges, and ornaments whose craftsmanship exceeds anything found in the earlier valley burials. Yet there is no ostentatious display, no princely tombs. Not yet. Instead, the objects suggest distinction, tempered by restraint, as if society were testing the boundaries of status before embracing the monumental expressions yet to come. These emerging hilltop centers represent a quiet turning point. For the first time, the Hallstatt world begins to imagine itself in layered heights, literal and social. Mines below, settlements above, networks spreading outward, complexity forming like mist condensing into shape. But even as these communities strengthened their vantage, another question deepened. What would happen when the wealth accumulating beneath the mountains and flowing along the rivers demanded symbols powerful enough to anchor its meaning? And how long could these early heights hold before the Hallstatt world rose into its full, resplendent form? One that would leave behind some of the most breathtaking burial mounds and artifacts Europe had ever known. There is a point, somewhere between the deepening mines and the rising hilltop settlements, where the archaeological record grows unexpectedly luminous, not from gold, its presence is rare, but from the sheer concentration of finely crafted objects that suddenly appear in graves, workshops, and ritual spaces. Why does the material world of the Hallstatt people begin to glow with such refinement at this particular moment? Why do objects that once served mere function now seem to carry intention, symbolism, and an aesthetic clarity that feels almost prophetic of the cultural heights soon to come? The metalwork tells the first hints of this shift. Bronze, though no longer the dominant material, does not fade away. Instead, it transforms. Its surfaces become canvases for patterns so deliberate they almost resemble script: geometric lattices, flowing curves, motifs formed by countless hammer strokes. The artisans who shape these objects no longer appear as simple craftspeople responding to need. They seem to sculpt identity itself. A belt plate recovered from a burial near the Enns River bears an intricate procession of animals, stylized deer, and birds, whose forms blur the line between reality and myth. The artistry suggests hands accustomed to both tradition and innovation, hands capable of sensing that society was preparing to move into a more ceremonial phase of existence. Pottery, too, begins reflecting this subtle awakening. The vessels grow thinner, their shapes more confident, their surfaces polished to a sheen that captures light like still water. Patterns shift from rigid geometry to motifs that spiral and ripple, as if echoing distant influences carried along trade routes. Traces of pigment appear, faint but unmistakable, hinting that color may once have played a greater role than the earth allows us to see now. When held, even as fragments, these shards convey an odd sense of balance, an impression that design was becoming as important as function. This emerging elegance extends beyond artifacts into the construction of everyday structures. Foundations discovered near the western valleys show buildings with specialized rooms, spaces dedicated not to sleep or hearth, but craft, storage, preparation. A few contain raised platforms whose purpose remains unclear. Perhaps workbenches, perhaps altars, perhaps something in between. The organization of these spaces suggests an increasing division of labor and the rise of individuals whose work shaped not only tools but meanings. Yet, even as the material world grows more refined, clues surface, suggesting new forms of social complexity. Burials begin to show subtle hierarchy. Not the monumental princely tombs of the later Hallstatt period, but quieter distinctions. A unique brooch placed near the collarbone, a sword positioned at a precise angle beside a cremation urn, a stacked arrangement of drinking vessels implying ceremonial feasting. These details whisper of roles emerging: leaders, negotiators, ritual specialists, though no single grave yet claims the full weight of authority. Perhaps the most revealing clues come from sites near the old river crossings. Here, archaeologists discovered remains of large feasting events, animal bones split for marrow, oversized pottery vessels bearing residue of fermented drinks, fragments of utensils shaped for communal use rather than household meals. Such gatherings were not casual. They required planning, surplus, and intention. And within such gatherings, influence could form, alliances could be strengthened, and narratives could be shaped. In these feasts, one might glimpse the early architecture of Hallstatt leadership: fluid, persuasive, built not from stone walls, but from shared rituals. In the same layers, small items imported from afar continue to surface. A glass bead with swirling coloration, characteristic of the Italian peninsula. A piece of bronze worked with techniques common in the Eastern Mediterranean. A sliver of amber polished into a shape resembling a droplet of frozen light. These objects seem less like trade goods and more like symbols carried by those who traveled widely or interacted with distant traders. Their presence hints at the emergence of mediators, individuals who bridge the internal world of the Hallstatt valleys with the wider, restless continent beyond. As material refinement and social complexity expand in tandem, the culture appears to stand at the edge of transformation. Everything, craft, ritual, trade, settlement, seems to be leaning toward a moment when the Hallstatt world will step into the full radiance of its identity, expressing itself with unprecedented confidence. Yet one question remains suspended in the archaeological silence. What catalyst would push these communities from subtle complexity into the opulence and hierarchy that would soon define their golden age? And what forces, material, spiritual, or political, would shape the first true elites whose graves would reshape our understanding of early Iron Age Europe? There is a point at which the Hallstatt record ceases to whisper and begins, quietly yet unmistakably, to declare itself. It happens in the graves, those deep, silent archives where intention survives long after memory fades. But in one particular valley, archaeologists encountered something that unsettles the linear assumptions often applied to ancient societies. A burial whose richness does not align with the modest dwellings nearby, whose objects far exceed the scale expected for the era. Why does this grave appear earlier than the grand princely tombs, as though one life momentarily leapt ahead of its age? And what does it reveal about the forces gathering beneath the surface of Hallstatt society? The grave lay beneath a low mound that had collapsed over centuries, its timbers softened into loam. Yet its interior told another story. A wooden chamber, delicately crafted from beams cut with iron tools, held the remains of an individual whose gender archaeologists still debate. Surrounding the cremated bones were objects that spoke of rare distinction. A bronze vessel adorned with incised animals in procession, a sword whose balance and finish suggest ceremonial rather than practical purpose, fragments of textile woven with a complexity unknown in everyday garments. Even the pottery had an elegance absent in ordinary assemblages. The vessel walls thin to near translucence, their surfaces burnished to a quiet glow. This lone grave hints at something stirring, the possibility that certain individuals had begun to embody roles that transcended the household or craft guild. Whether through trade, ritual, or negotiation, influence may have begun coalescing around those who could navigate both the internal fabric of their community and the widening web of external connections. The grave's offering suggests links not only to local artisans, but to distant regions. Chemical analysis of some objects hints at alloys from southern sources, while stylistic nuances echo patterns glimpsed in northern Italy. Such convergence implies an individual who stood at the meeting point of multiple worlds. Yet, beyond this singular burial, broader evidence of change emerges across the landscape. Pathways leading toward hilltop settlements grow wider, more compacted, as though carrying heavier traffic. Storage structures expand in capacity, implying surplus not only for winter survival, but for redistribution, perhaps as gifts, feasts, or offerings meant to bind alliances. The organization of space itself shifts. Open areas appear near fortifications, their soil compacted by the weight of gatherings large enough to leave a geological trace. These are the faint outlines of assembly grounds, places where decisions may have been made, disputes resolved, or rituals performed under the watch of mountains that had shaped generations. Signs of heightened ceremony become difficult to ignore. In certain settlements, clusters of drinking vessels appear unusually concentrated, and residues on their interiors suggest beverages more elaborate than simple fermented grain, perhaps mixtures flavored with herbs, honey, or imported ingredients. Such feasts, ephemeral though they are, may have played a crucial role in elevating status. In societies without writing, power often forms not through decree, but through performance. Shared experiences that linger as collective memory, binding communities through emotion as much as through necessity. Across the rivers, the change manifests differently. At a crossing along the Danube, archaeologists uncovered what may have been a ritual deposit, a collection of objects placed together with purposeful arrangement. A sword bent into a graceful arc, a bronze cauldron pierced deliberately, fragments of coral nestled beside animal bones. These offerings suggest an increasing engagement with forces perceived as shaping fortune and fate. If the mines and trade routes brought prosperity, they may also have brought anxiety and awareness that external currents could shift without warning. Ritual became a means to negotiate uncertainty, to appeal to powers imagined as dwelling in water, earth, or the unseen spaces between. Amid all these changes, burial expressions, architectural shifts, ritual deposits, one pattern becomes clear. Hallstatt society was beginning to stratify, not through domination or conquest, but through gradual differentiation of roles and access. Some individuals gained the ability to mobilize resources, attract artisans, host feasts, establish alliances. The early echoes of elite identity were forming, still subtle, still fluid, yet unmistakable in their trajectory. But as elites emerged, so too did the need for symbols powerful enough to embody their authority. And this raises the next question. What would happen when the full wealth of the mines and the reach of long-distance trade converged, granting certain individuals unprecedented influence? Would the valleys accept this rising hierarchy quietly? Or would the symbols of power need to grow monumental enough to persuade an entire culture to believe in them? There is a moment when the artifacts stop whispering of subtle distinction and begin to indicate something bolder. Objects so finely made, so deliberate in their symbolism, that they cannot be dismissed as mere personal belongings. They look instead like anchors of identity, markers of authority worn or displayed by individuals who no longer stood merely among their kin, but above them. Yet before the great princely burials dominate the Hallstatt horizon, another question arises from these emerging signs of rank. How does a society without writing, without monumental palaces, without recorded rulers, begin to shape the idea of leadership powerful enough to transform its entire cultural landscape? The evidence emerges slowly. In one valley, bronze ornaments appear, whose craftsmanship surpasses anything of prior centuries. Their surfaces gleam with carefully hammered textures, patterns flowing with a confidence that suggests a deeper understanding of metal's expressive potential. In another region, an iron sword is found, whose blade carries faint traces of pattern welding, an advanced technique in which different grades of iron are fused to create both strength and beauty. Though the sword's edge is dulled by time, its artistry speaks of prestige. These objects were not simply tools, they were statements. Yet their presence alone does not reveal who wielded them. Instead, clues lie in their distribution. Certain households, identified only by the foundations left behind, begin to contain more high-quality objects, more storage space, more evidence of specialized labor. The proximity of artisans to these dwellings suggests patronage, a relationship in which skill and resources flowed through the hands of those able to command them. But if authority was forming, it remained delicate, balanced on the shifting ground of tradition and negotiation. Across the rivers and hills, changes in ceremony mirror this emerging stratification. Feasting becomes more orchestrated. The vessels used grow larger, their capacities suited for gatherings of dozens rather than families. Some are made exclusively for pouring, their shapes preventing everyday use. Residue inside them contains hints of imported ingredients, wine-like ferments, herbs from distant lowlands, flavors that suggest not only indulgence, but messaging. Look how far our reach extends beyond these mountains. Such events likely served as stages where influence was displayed without words, where those who hosted, who gave generously, who possessed goods from afar, demonstrated their ability to mediate between the community and the wider world. Even the organization of landscape reflects this shift. In certain valleys, paths begin to converge, not randomly, but towards central spaces, open areas whose repeated use imprints them into the soil. These may have been meeting grounds, or ritual sites, or places where disputes were settled. Their very existence implies coordination, and with coordination comes the possibility of those who guide it, whose voices, gestures, or presence carried weight. Yet nothing captures the rising tide of authority more vividly than the graves that begin to grow larger and more symbolically charged. Before the grand mounds appear, smaller tombs foreshadow them. Timber chambers built with meticulous care. Objects placed with an exactness that seems almost choreographed. Combs carved from antler, torques shaped from bronze, knives laid at angles that might represent pathways or journeys. These arrangements hint at narratives now lost, stories of how individuals wished to be seen in death, and how the community chose to remember them. But it is not only the dead who reflect this shift. The living left traces as well. Workshops from this period show increasing specialization. Bone carvers, whose tools were honed for intricate detail. Metal workers, whose furnaces burned hotter and more consistently. Weavers, whose fabrics grew finer, more patterned, perhaps even more symbolic. Such concentration of skill often accompanies the rise of elites, those who commission, who distribute, who possess the means to turn craft into prestige. And beneath all this activity, the mines continue their descent. The deeper the shafts went, the more valuable the salt, the more labor required, the more coordination necessary to sustain extraction. Wealth and organization intertwined, and in that intertwining, the foundations of elite power took shape, not through conquest, but through accumulation. through stewardship of resources, through the quiet but formidable pull of the mountain's crystalline wealth. Yet the question lingers in the shadows of this ascent. When privilege began concentrating in certain hands, how did the rest of the community perceive it? Did they accept these early elites as natural figures of guidance, or did tension simmer beneath the surface, waiting for a symbol powerful enough to justify growing inequality? And when that symbol finally appeared, monumental, radiant, unmistakable, how would it transform the Hallstatt world and the stories they left behind? There is a moment in the Hallstatt narrative when the earth itself seems to hesitate before revealing what lies beneath. Excavators speak of it in quiet tones. The subtle shift in soil density, the faint resistance as a spade meets timber, long hidden, the sudden recognition that they have touched the threshold of something vast. Why do these moments always feel like intrusions upon a secret the land tried for centuries to keep? And why does the first true princely burial appear not as a gradual development, but as a sudden, breathtaking emergence, an eruption of wealth and symbolism beyond anything hinted at before? The chamber uncovered in one of these early princely mounds did not announce itself with grandeur. From the surface, the mound looked like any other rise in the landscape, softened by grass and time. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lay a wooden room, large enough to hold not only the remains of an elite individual, but also a constellation of objects that seemed to redefine the Hallstatt world. Bronze vessels with spiraling motifs, so large and thin-walled that they must have been handled with both reverence and skill. A long iron sword balanced to near perfection. Ornaments of gold, rare in the region, shaped with a delicacy that suggests artisans who had studied metals far beyond their homeland. But the most striking detail is not the wealth itself. It is the precision with which everything was arranged. The sword aligned toward a particular direction, as though guiding a journey. The vessels placed in an arc, their positions hinting at ceremony rather than display. Carved wooden furniture, now collapsed but reconstructible, indicates that the deceased was seated or reclined as if continuing a feast begun in life. These choices reflect not only status, but an entire cosmology. To bury someone with such intention is to embed their story into the soil, to proclaim that their life touched forces larger than the community alone. And yet this burial does not stand isolated. Even as the mound reveals its secrets, other signs of elite culture begin emerging across the Hallstatt region. Settlement patterns shift once more. Hilltop centers grow more fortified, not with crude palisades, but with complex ramparts formed from timber, clay, and stone, arranged in patterns reminiscent of Mediterranean building techniques. The adoption of such architecture suggests contact, not fleeting trade, but sustained interaction with cultures whose own elites had long asserted power through monumental construction. Workshops in these centers reveal specialization of an entirely new scale. Artisans crafting fine bronze vessels work beside those shaping iron weapons with advanced tempering techniques. Woodworkers carve furniture whose angles and joints speak of both comfort and ceremony. Weavers produce textiles patterned with repeating motifs that may represent symbols of rank, clan, or lineage. For the first time, the traces of craft form a unified aesthetic, one that seems to echo through every domain of life. Feasting, too, transforms. The quantities of animal bones found at certain high-status sites imply gatherings far larger than earlier communal meals. But it is the diversity of remains, cattle, pigs, imported delicacies, that hints at something more than sustenance. Feasts had become performances of power, opportunities to display networks of exchange, mastery of resources, and the ability to summon people across distances. In such gatherings, the elite could shape narrative, memory, and allegiance without ever issuing commands. And beneath all of this, the mines deepen into labyrinths. Salt extraction grows so extensive that entire galleries appear preserved by the mineral itself. Tools left in place, garments still bearing folds of fabric, even footprints etched into the soft floor. These are not simply remnants of labor. They are echoes of a workforce whose efforts supported elite ascendancy. The scale of mining suggests complex organization. Specialists, coordinators, provisions managers. Though the details remain invisible in the archaeological silence. As the mines fueled prosperity and the elite class crystallized, the cultural landscape shifted irrevocably. Objects grew more elaborate, ritual intensified. Diplomacy likely flowed between Hallstatt elites and distant powers, hinted at by imported goods and shared motifs. A new kind of authority emerged, not enforced by armies, but embodied through material brilliance, ritual depth, and the quiet, irresistible pull of wealth that came from beneath the mountain. Yet this rise carries an unsettling question. How did communities accustomed to shared rhythms react to the ascendancy of a few? Did they embrace these early elites as custodians of prosperity? Or did uncertainty ripple beneath the surface? And as princely power gathered momentum, what symbolic gesture, what monumental expression would announce that Hallstatt had entered its true golden age, one that would reshape the story of early Europe? There is an unease that settles over the Hallstatt record at the moment their princely class reaches full expression. An unease not of decline, but of sudden brilliance, as though a culture long gathering its breath finally exhales in a singular, dazzling gesture. It becomes visible in a burial unlike any that preceded it, a resting place so elaborately constructed that it seems to command silence even now. But before describing its splendor, a question must be asked. How did a society without writing choose the precise moment when its symbols of authority would crystallize into monumental form? And what convergence of wealth, belief, and ambition pushed these elites to shape tombs that transformed death into a stage for eternal presence? The mound at the center of this transformation rose higher than those before it, its earthen slopes once smoothed by countless hands. Beneath it lay a wooden chamber, crafted from timbers so massive they must have been selected with ceremony. Inside, a body had been placed not as a hushed farewell, but as the pivot of a story, surrounded by objects that seemed to radiate meaning. A massive bronze cauldron, Its handles, shaped into the heads of fantastic creatures, dominated the chamber. Near it lay a long iron sword, whose craftsmanship would not be matched for generations. Its blade balanced so precisely that it could be lifted with 2 fingers at its center. Elsewhere, a 4-wheeled burial wagon rested upon the soil, its intricate bronze fittings glinting even now when torchlight enters the reconstructed chamber. Yet the objects alone do not convey the full gravity of the moment. What unsettles the imagination is the scale of coordination required to assemble such a tomb. The bronze cauldron, with its foreign stylistic influences, traveled great distances before reaching this valley. The wagon's components were crafted by specialized artisans, each working in a tradition already refined over centuries. The wooden chamber required trees felled at specific seasons, their trunks shaped and transported with effort so immense that an entire community must have participated. Death, in this context, became not an ending, but a communal declaration of identity, power, and continuity. Meanwhile, beyond the mound, the landscapes of Hallstatt settlements grew more structured. In certain fortified centers, large halls appear, structures wide enough to accommodate gatherings, feasts, or councils. Their floors bear traces of repeated movement, their hearths larger than those of ordinary houses. The artifacts found nearby, drinking vessels, decorative pins, burned bones from ritual feasts, suggest that these halls served as stages where elites enacted their authority through generosity, negotiation, and spectacle. The architecture does not impose power through height or scale. Rather, it embodies a form of presence, a place where ideas and alliances could reshape the fabric of community life. The mines, too, mirrored this intensification. Deep within the mountain, tools were left in position suggesting structured shifts of labor. Leather sacks, salt-encrusted and time-hardened, held remains of provisions. Wooden ladders, long since collapsed, once spanned vertical shafts carved into the heart of the earth. These are not marks of disordered labor, but of an organized system, one that required planning, leadership, and the ability to sustain workers in darkness for long hours. Salt preserved food across seasons. It preserved status across generations. It became the invisible engine behind princely power. And as elites rose, so too did the complexity of trade. More Mediterranean goods entered the valleys, each carrying echoes of distant lands. Greek pottery featuring mythological scenes. Etruscan bronze vessels whose forms mirrored those placed in their own elite tombs. Amber crafted into beads of exquisite translucence. These items were more than luxuries. They were tokens of connection, artifacts that authenticated an elite's ability to engage with a world far broader than their mountains. But such connections carried risks as well. Influence traveled both ways. With every foreign object came new ideas of hierarchy, of ceremony, of wealth displayed without apology. Did the Hallstatt elites seek to emulate distant powers, or did they reinterpret foreign symbols through the lens of their own traditions? And how did their communities respond to the growing distance between those who mined the salt and those who commanded the feasts? For even as the princely class solidified its role, the signs of tension subtle, quiet, but unmistakable, begin to stir beneath the surface, which leads to the next question. When power gathers this brightly, what shadows begin to form at its edges, and how would these shadows shape the turning of the Hallstatt world toward its approaching peak? There is a moment in the Hallstatt story when prosperity, instead of bringing clarity, begins to generate a new kind of ambiguity, one that creeps through the archaeological layers like a fine mist. It becomes visible not in dramatic destruction or sudden collapse, but in subtle shifts. Settlements mysteriously reorganized, routes rerouted, ceremonial spaces repurposed, as though the people sensed that their world, newly radiant, was also becoming newly vulnerable. Why does this unease surface precisely when wealth and influence reach their zenith? And why do the signs of strain appear intertwined with the most refined expressions of Hallstatt culture? In the fortified centers, the great halls once filled with feasts now show evidence of uneven use. Some hearths grow larger, layered with soot from intense gatherings. Others fall quiet, their floors accumulating dust rather than footfall. At first glance, this seems like randomness, but a deeper reading suggests shifting alliances, power moving between groups rather than stabilizing around a single lineage. Perhaps elites were negotiating among themselves, balancing influence like a delicate equilibrium of salt and iron. Or perhaps new families, strengthened by trade, marriage, or mining wealth, were rising alongside established ones, quietly altering the internal dynamics of the Hallstatt world. The mines mirror this complexity. In certain galleries, excavation intensifies, the walls scarred by relentless extraction. In others, activity dwindles, tools abandoned as though workers chose to redirect their efforts elsewhere. Such uneven patterns hint at competition, subtle, not overt. Control of the richest veins may have become contested, not necessarily through open conflict, but through negotiation, influence, and the silent pressure of necessity. A few tunnels contain offerings placed with unusual care. A wooden bowl filled with grains, a bronze pin wrapped in cloth, a pickhead laid beside a torch. These objects may reflect fears emerging within the mining communities, offerings to stabilize a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable. Trade routes, once straightforward, begin to divide. New paths appear, branching from older ones. Along these branches, archaeologists find small clusters of goods, broken amphorae, fragments of bronze, bits of coral, suggesting camps or outposts used intermittently. Perhaps traders were experimenting with alternative routes to avoid competition or tolls imposed by rising elites. Or maybe these deviations reflect shifting political landscapes beyond Hallstatt territory, the stirrings of cultures whose movements would eventually reshape all of Central Europe. Even in ritual life, the signs shift. Lakes that once received simple offerings now hold more dramatic deposits. In some waterlogged contexts, entire sets of weapons appear together. Swords, spears, and shields cast deliberately into the depths. The metals show little sign of real battle. These are not remnants of war. They are statements, perhaps attempts to appeal to powers invoked to maintain balance in a world tilting toward complexity. The deliberate killing of weapons suggests anxiety. If iron symbolized control, then breaking it may have symbolized surrender to forces larger than any one lineage or leader. The graves, too, reflect this shifting emotional landscape. Some elites receive grand burials with exquisite goods. Others, from the same period, lie in simpler chambers, accompanied by objects that seem intentionally modest. This inconsistency is perplexing. Did status fluctuate rapidly? Were alliances unstable? Or were some families choosing a quieter form of prestige, one emphasizing restraint rather than opulence? The soil remains silent, but the pattern hints at the emergence of competing ideologies of leadership. Amid all this, one archaeological phenomenon stands out: the growing prominence of the horse. Horse trappings, bits, harness fittings, decorative plaques appear in increasing numbers, often of exceptional craftsmanship. Horses were more than transport, they were symbols of movement, speed, connection. Their rise may indicate that elite identity no longer rested solely on control of mines and feasts, but on mobility, the ability to traverse regions, forge alliances, and shape influence across distances. A leader on horseback possessed a new kind of power: fluid, sudden, unpredictable. And perhaps it is this mobility, this restless motion, that begins to unsettle the once stable rhythms of the Hallstatt world. For when power can move, it can shift. When authority can travel, it can fracture. And when prestige depends on far-reaching connections, the local foundation becomes fragile. Which raises the next question. As the Hallstatt elites embraced expansion and mobility, what forces, seen or unseen, were gathering at the edges of their world, preparing to test the limits of their brilliance? There is a whisper in the archaeological layers of the later Hallstatt period, so faint that early researchers dismissed it as coincidence, yet it appears too consistently to ignore. Certain settlements show signs of hurried alteration: walls reinforced at odd angles, storage pits emptied unexpectedly, ceramics abruptly shifted to new styles as if responding to influences that arrived faster than cultural memory could absorb. What force would cause such subtle dissonance within a society seemingly at its height? And why do these echoes appear almost simultaneously across regions separated by mountains and rivers, as though a distant tremor had reached them all at once? The clues lie partly in the shifting horizon beyond the Hallstatt world. To the north and northeast, small but persistent movements began to ripple across the landscapes of Central Europe. Groups who had once lived at the edge of Hallstatt trade routes now displayed their own refinements in weaponry and pottery. Signs of rising identities shaped by new metallurgical strategies and distinct symbolic vocabularies. Their graves contain weapons longer and more flexible than the Hallstatt blades, suggesting unfamiliar fighting techniques. Their ornaments show motifs that flow rather than angle, patterns that would one day define the Latin aesthetic. These emerging cultures were not intruders yet, but their presence hints at an impending shift, an approaching tide rather than a sudden storm. Along the Danube corridor, the traces grow more complex. Some Hallstatt sites show intensified trade with Mediterranean partners, while others appear to lose access abruptly. Amphorae, once abundant, diminish in frequency. Imported bronze vessels become rarer. Perhaps foreign powers shifted alliances. Perhaps new middlemen rose, altering the flow of prestige goods. The archaeological record reveals gaps, not absences, but unevenness, like a road whose stones loosen one by one. And in a society built on the delicate choreography of exchange, even small disruptions could send ripples through the social order. Within the fortified centers, the halls of feasting take on a new atmosphere. The residue of gatherings becomes more abundant in some places, curiously sparse in others. One hall shows evidence of renewed vigor, multiple hearths burning simultaneously, large quantities of cattle bones, indicating feasts meant to reinforce unity. Another shows signs of abandonment, its floorboards warped by time rather than trodden by celebrants. Perhaps certain leaders attempted to consolidate influence, while others struggled to maintain their foothold. No single pattern dominates. Instead, the landscape suggests negotiation in motion, alliances forming and dissolving as fluidly as river currents. Even ritual practices begin to transform under these pressures. In lake deposits once reserved for deliberate, orderly offerings, newer assemblages appear disordered. Objects placed hurriedly, weapons less carefully bent, votive vessels arranged with less precision. These changes may reflect moments of anxiety, appeals made not with confidence but desperation. The water, once a calm intermediary between worlds, now receives gestures sharpened by urgency. Were the Hallstatt people sensing the emergence of forces they could not predict or control? The minds deepen still, but their rhythm shifts. Some galleries show intensified production. Walls scraped clean, floors compacted by many feet. Others seem abandoned mid-strike, tools left where they fell. It is as though the mountain's breath had become uneven. Certain veins were pushed beyond sustainability. Others may have become contested zones between groups seeking to secure their own futures. Tools once used routinely begin to exhibit wear patterns inconsistent with steady labor. Abrupt changes in force or angle, as though miners themselves worked under tension or haste. The once stable heartbeat of the salt economy begins to stutter. Yet amidst these signs of adaptation, conflict remains largely invisible. No great battle layers appear, no burned settlements marking catastrophic raids. Instead, the tension manifests as rearrangement. Paths diverted, storage relocated, rituals adjusted, leadership strategies rewritten in silence. The Hallstatt world was not collapsing. It was bending, reshaping itself in response to pressures both internal and external. And in this bending lies the hint of something profound, a culture at the threshold of transformation, its brilliance still glowing, but its foundations beginning to shift. The elites continued to bury their dead with splendor. Artisans still crafted metal and ceramic with breathtaking finesse. Yet beneath this radiance runs an undercurrent, a sense that the world around them had begun to change faster than memory could stabilize. So the question emerges in the twilight of the Hallstatt Golden Age. As new powers stirred beyond the mountains and the delicate architecture of prestige began to show its strain, how would this old, salt-born civilization respond? Would it harden, fracture, or evolve into something entirely new? And what forces already forming on the horizon would shape the fate of a culture standing unknowingly at the edge of its final turning. There is a moment in the Hallstatt sequence when the soil begins speaking in contradictions. Settlements once thriving on hilltops show signs of abandonment, while new dwellings appear hastily in the valleys below. Fortifications, once carefully maintained, sag in their foundations as though their builders no longer believed they were worth defending. And yet, in the very same layers, grave goods remain exquisitely crafted, feasting vessels still gleam with symbolic intention, and the mines continue to yield salt with the determination of a society refusing to let go of its identity. Why does the archaeological record present both brilliance and retreat, resilience and unraveling, as if the culture were shimmering between endurance and disappearance? The first hints of instability do not come from war, but from climate. Cores extracted from alpine peat bogs reveal a prolonged period of cooling and dampness beginning around the early 5th century BCE. Grain pollen diminishes, replaced by hardy grasses and shrubs more tolerant of unpredictable seasons. Agricultural land, long depended upon, begins to falter. The terraces built over generations lose their viability. Hunger likely emerged not suddenly, but slowly, like a shadow lengthening over the rhythm of daily life. And in societies where elites draw their authority from surplus, scarcity becomes a quiet but insistent destabilizer. The mines, once the unshakable engine of Hallstatt prosperity, also begin to reflect these tremors. Some galleries show intensified extraction, as though communities hope to compensate for agricultural shortages by expanding their salt wealth. But deeper shafts reveal signs of neglect, supports left unreplaced, tools scattered as if workers fled mid-shift, and rubble where once there had been systematic removal. Perhaps the mountain itself became unpredictable. Perhaps accidents, or rumors of accidents, spread fear among miners whose livelihoods depended on entering those darkened chambers. A few abandoned shafts contain objects that resemble emergency offerings: small bowls, fragments of textile, a wooden charm shaped vaguely like a human figure. These gestures speak not of ritual confidence, but of desperation, as though the mountain no longer felt like an ally. Trade, the second pillar of Hallstatt influence, also falters. Imported goods diminish in number and diversity. The amphorae that once carried wine from distant coasts arrive less frequently. Bronze vessels from Italy become scarce. Amber routes shift. Whether caused by disruptions abroad or the rising dominance of emerging Latin networks, the result is unmistakable. The elite can no longer rely on distant alliances to reinforce their prestige. A feast loses symbolic power when it lacks the taste of foreign luxury. A leader's authority dims when their ornaments no longer whisper of faraway connections. The great halls of earlier generations now bear scars of their changing circumstances. Some are repurposed into storage, others are partially dismantled, their timbers reused for more practical needs. A few show signs of sudden abandonment, vessels left where they fell, tools uncollected, a hearth extinguished before its time. These are not marks of ruin by fire or enemy assault, but of communities quietly reshaping themselves, perhaps breaking apart, perhaps merging with others. Leadership structures, once fluid but strong, begin to lose coherence. Without consistent surplus, without stable trade, without ritual certainty, the authority of the princely class begins to waver. The rituals themselves reflect this uncertainty. Weapon deposits, once meticulously arranged, become chaotic, as though thrown into lakes rather than placed. Graves of the period vary wildly, some retaining the grandeur of earlier elites, others appearing starkly austere. A few burials contain iron weapons broken in ways inconsistent with earlier ceremonial killing, suggesting frustration rather than reverence. Even pottery styles, usually the most conservative cultural markers, begin to shift toward lighter, more dynamic forms that echo the early Latin aesthetic. Perhaps new ideas were imported, or perhaps the Hallstatt people, searching for stability, found themselves drawn toward symbols offered by emerging powers. Yet what is most haunting about this transitional period is what does not appear. Destruction layers, burned fortresses, massacres. The Hallstatt world did not fall through violence. It dissolved through transformation. Communities moved. Alliances shifted. Beliefs adapted. People survived by becoming something slightly different from what their ancestors had been. The culture's brilliance did not collapse. It transmuted, dispersing into new forms that archaeology recognizes but cannot fully reconstruct. And so the question emerges, soft but persistent. As the Hallstatt world loosened its hold on its golden age and stepped into a new horizon, what became of the people who once ruled through salt, feasts, and ritual splendor? And how would their legacy echo into the dawn of the Latin world that waited just beyond the threshold of their fading light? There is a silence at the end of the Hallstatt sequence, one so delicate that archaeologists often speak of it not as an ending, but as the thinning of a presence. Valleys, once filled with the rhythm of forges, feasts, and caravans, become quieter in the archaeological record. Yet the people do not vanish. Their tools do not disappear. Their motifs do not collapse. Instead, the material world begins to shimmer with new contours, as if a culture long bound to the steady weight of salt and the deep breath of mountains had stepped lightly into a new form. Why does the transition feel less like demise and more like metamorphosis? And how does a civilization so anchored in the earth learn to move into a horizon shaped by motion, fluidity, and renewed imagination? The final layers of Hallstatt settlements show traces of continuity woven through change. Pottery becomes lighter, the once precise geometric lines bending into curves that resemble vines, spirals, the unfurling of new thought. Iron swords lengthen, their silhouettes shifting toward the sweeping forms that would define the warriors of the Latin age. Ornaments transform, no longer rigidly symmetrical, but flowing like wind-carved patterns in snow. Even the graves reflect this soft transition. Chambers smaller, yet adorned with objects that seem to hum with a different kind of symbolism. More dynamic, less static, as though life itself were conceived not as a circle, but a path. In this shifting tapestry, one senses a cultural pulse moving away from the monumental stillness of the great mounds toward something more airy, more kinetic. Perhaps the people grew restless under the weight of the princely era. Perhaps younger generations, shaped by changing climates and new trade networks, found resonance in symbols brought by travelers from distant plains. Or perhaps the culture simply evolved, as living worlds do, responding to centuries of accumulation, tension, and adaptation. The mines, once the beating heart of Hallstatt wealth, begin to show signs of gentle retirement, not abandonment, but repurposing. Some shafts were sealed intentionally, as though closing a chapter rather than fleeing danger. Others were left accessible, their entrances shaped by wind and time, becoming quiet monuments to the labor that built an age. Tools left in these galleries feel less like crime scenes of collapse and more like offerings placed by workers marking the end of a long partnership with the mountain. Trade routes shift decisively. Goods that once flowed into the valleys now move along new paths forged by emerging Celtic networks. The Danube becomes a corridor not of isolation, but of migration, carrying ideas rather than luxuries, carrying new identities that did not erase Hallstatt memory, but absorbed it, transformed it, and let it breathe in different lands. Through this migration, slow, generational, unrecorded, Hallstatt did not fade. It dispersed like seeds cast upon riverbanks. And so the culture's legacy enters the archaeological record not as a final word, but as a resonance. The Latin world, known for its sweeping art and restless expansion, carries within it the unmistakable imprint of Hallstatt refinement, the precision of metalwork, the depth of ritual, the interplay between landscape and meaning. Even Rome, centuries later, would absorb traces of these shapes. Spirals, curves, quiet geometries that had first been pressed into clay high in the Austrian mountains. Yet the most elusive question remains: what did the last generation of Hallstatt people feel as their world shifted around them? Did they sense the transformation, or did life continue with its familiar rhythms, each choice forming a bridge into a future they could not name? Archaeology offers only fragments, shadows of gestures, echoes of ceremonies, fingerprints pressed into pottery before it hardened. The rest dissolves into silence. And so this journey ends not with certainty, but with a question suspended like mist above an alpine lake. What of a culture survives beyond its artifacts, beyond its mines, beyond its graves? Perhaps the answer lies in the way its presence lingers, in the faint geometry of a sword's hilt, in a spiral carved on a pot shard, in a wooden beam preserved by salt as if time itself refused to let it go. Perhaps it lies in the quiet truth that civilizations do not vanish. They fold into the world that follows, imprinting themselves like constellations whose stars shift but never disappear. And somewhere, deep within the mountain that once glowed with the heartbeat of Hallstatt life, the salt still remembers, waiting for those who listen closely enough to hear the stories it has carried through the dark. Thank you for journeying with us through the quiet echoes of the Hallstatt world. If you're listening as you drift toward sleep, may the mountains, the rivers, and the ancient footsteps that once shaped this land settle gently in your thoughts. If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to stay connected with the Cryptic Realm channel. Your presence here helps us continue exploring the forgotten corners of history and the mysteries time tried to hide. Let your curiosity guide you. Follow the channel. Share the journey with someone who loves the ancient and the unknown, and return whenever you wish to travel further into the realms where silence remembers more than words ever could. Until next time, rest well, dream deeply, and let the past whisper you into sleep.